Hey, folks, we're back and shifting a cloud gear slightly, but we're talking about Microsoft is now making available 365 local. It's basically the cloud version of their platform is now available on premise. If this sounds like the world has been turned upside down, it is because it is. We just spent years moving everything to the cloud, but now our friends in Europe are concerned about control and we're building out sovereignty clouds. And of course, now Microsoft is responding to that need. It's interesting. I guess, at some point, Microsoft probably could have done this at any point, but they're doing it now because the Europeans are mandating it. But Stacey, is our mindset changing about what the definition of security is here from our friends in Europe? Because, well, these sovereign clouds seem to be driving all kinds of decisions that I probably would have said were not likely to happen a year ago.
Yeah. Well, I think with Europeans, they just have a very different way of thinking about their data than we have historically in the US. And that's creating a lot of tension. So you've got things like the GDPR over there. I mean, the Europeans have really set the course for data protection, whereas in the US, we're much more fragmented and we give companies access to the data. So they're saying, we don't want our data in US hands. We want to bring it on-prem. We want to bring it into it, make sure that all our data stays in Europe. Then that does become a different way of thinking because it's essentially kind of drawing a little bit of a line in the sand. I mean, is it saying we don't trust you? We want to keep our data here. This is why. And Microsoft is now racing to meet that request and bringing out our standards that we say, okay, if we're not going to hold the same standards as our European friends, then we have to essentially bring those standards to them and take them out of the US. And it's a different way of thinking than we've thought in the US.
And without it, we can't support Cray. If you're in the EU, you have to have this technology because they have to support the Cyber Resiliency Act, and we're not moving that direction.
I was at InfoSec Europe, just a couple weeks ago, and everyone was asking, okay, so you're GDPR certified, right? You're able to play in our space. I mean, we kept getting that question over and over and over again, so it's clearly at the forefront of their minds.
Mitch, we were just at AWS last week, and I was talking to them about this particular issue, and they were pointing out that, their preferred answer is a virtual private cloud. But even that, they said, the issue is these SaaS vendors, and it won't just be Microsoft, they're all going to wind up doing the same thing. And essentially, it's a managed hosting service now that they provide, and it doesn't scale out. So it's changing the way that they allocate compute resources and networking and just about everything that went with it. So I think this is a more fundamental IT change than we think. It's just not simply a matter of slapping a bunch of software and putting it in a different data center.
Well, it's a combination of things, to your point, Mike. There's a bit of nationalism in this, too. I remember being at SUSECON and Alan was there also, when you were hearing the discussions about what stack are we going to build on in Europe that doesn't rely on North American U.S. vendors. Can we be vendor independent from the US or less dependent upon them? That's why I guess Microsoft's taking a page out of the finger on the dike from the Dutch, because Denmark, Germany, I think it's Switzerland, if I remember right, have announced that they're tossing out Windows and Office in favor of Linux and LibreOffice. So they need to stem the tide of people saying we can't be dependent upon North American companies. If it's running in your data center, it's your data is protected, and Microsoft added some additional data protection to make sure that data doesn't leak out. Okay, I mean, it's about as much as Microsoft can do to try to keep them as customers. So I think there's a bit of survival to this too. It's not they aren't rushing for the doors quite yet, but they seem to be. There's a few folks are walking out of the movie unhappy with how it's gone so far.
I think there's an economic component to it too. Cloud data centers are a business that's really driven by economies of scale, right? And the bigger you are, the better economics you get out of it. If it truly is driven on the EU side by nationalism, then the economies of scale don't accrue if you have to have a data center in every country in the EU. And that just can't scale. And not only can't it scale, you also face the much stricter environmental regulations and the lack of energy that you have there. And so it's a transfer of the economics back to the buyer rather than to the seller, right? So now the corporations have to own the CapEx again rather than Microsoft owning it and taking advantage of the huge economies of scale.
So the sovereign IT, sovereign IP, sovereign cloud issue is not strictly a European issue. As a matter of fact, I'd say the US is pushing for their own sovereign data and sovereign IT, right? And we want to own the whole process from manufacturing all the way through. But you're seeing it in Asia. You're seeing it. It's the balkanization of the internet. Now, what happens though with this sovereign IT, sovereign cloud, is the local market big enough to warrant an investment to, in essence, recreate a whole cloud, a whole public cloud infrastructure for a given jurisdiction, for a given sovereignty, right? Much like GovCloud was done for the federal space, right? You recreated an entire kind of public cloud infrastructure. Now, if the EU can speak as one market with 32 countries or something in the EU now, that's certainly a big enough market to invest into creating an EU-wide true public cloud in every sense of the word, a hyperscaler kind of infrastructure that would be sovereign to the EU. If the EU is going to say each of the 32 individual nations need to have their own sovereign cloud or their own sovereign IT data, well, then providers are going to have to pick and choose. Certainly Germany, France, maybe Italy and Spain are big, but am I putting one in Albania? Or am I doing Liechtenstein? Switzerland? Well, Switzerland's pretty big. Denmark, yeah, but now you're starting to get into the nitty-gritty of 32 different markets. If it stays as one EU, it's certainly a big enough market to justify a hyperscaler.
I think the term sovereign, too, is a little bit misleading, to be honest, because no matter what you do, you're still dependent upon Microsoft. Right, it's they still have vendor lock-in. It's still, it's exposed to U.S. laws because it's Microsoft. So while it might be a local or private, it's hard to say. The term sovereign, I think, is a little bit marketing.
Well, but the wording there, right, is local control. I think what you're seeing in a lot of these sovereign deals, if you will, is that the vendor, in this case Microsoft, but it could be AWS, could be Google, could be others, are saying that they are going to comply with local government regulations. So if the government, most often this comes, can you turn over this data to the government? Will you give the government access? Or better yet, will you give the U.S. government access to data?
Well, it doesn't solve the skepticism around and being so attached and dependent upon a U.S. institution.
But I think it's two different things, though. I think one is a concern about being dependent on U.S. organizations for the technology, and the other concern is the data and data sovereignty and who can actually get access to that data. And I think that there's a little bit of rose-colored glasses there. The fear, particularly with the Patriot Act, was that the U.S. would come in and suck up EU citizen data, right? And therefore, they want that data to be resident in the EU, not in the U.S., but that, of course, leaves that data subject to EU governments sucking up that data. And there's actually a lot less protection there than there is on the US side. But regardless, I think that there are two separate concerns. One is the data sovereignty, and one is, are we independent of US vendors?
Well, there's also the problem of Hotel California in the cloud. Your data can check in, but you can never leave. That's a problem, too. It's hard to get out.
I would ask Alan the following question. How far can this go? Will the state of New York wake up one morning and say, you know what, we don't want data to be subject to the laws of Florida or Texas or any other state?
But Seriously though, so there, we do have interstate commerce clause of the Constitution, and we do have a web of laws when it comes to controlling. That's a federal, right? If it's when it comes to commerce as between the sovereign states, it's a federal, that the federal government has preempted that for themselves. So I would say New York or any state who made that sort of claim, even this lame duck Supreme Court that we have now would probably still have to uphold the Constitution and the Interstate Commerce Clause.
Well, it's not as clear cut as that. Unfortunately, right now we have a patchwork of privacy regulations. You have California and Virginia that have overlapping and sometimes conflicting regulations, and I don't think any corporation has yet brought suit to the Supreme Court to say that. But it's the potential of conflict is there with multiple states getting into their own version of the GDPR and the different requirements. And there are reporting requirements on data losses that are different between each. So it becomes complicated very quickly, which is what the Commerce Clause was meant to prevent. But we're not there yet.
Frankly, this is why, the preferred method of regulation is a national, whether we're talking about cybersecurity and privacy or we're talking about AI usage or what have you. Obviously, preferred would be a federal, nationwide type of regulation. But, we don't have the political will at the federal level to get things done a lot. And so it falls to states.
We have a Supreme Court that also seems to want to defer to the states whenever it can. So, states' rights may prevail.
I still think there's an argument to be made for the Commerce Clause. My 2 cents for what it's worth. All right, let's take a break. We'll come back and we've got our C block. This sounds like something out of like the movie Big with Tom Hanks. Platform fortune teller. Okay. We're watching Texture on Guys.